Massachusetts Senator Elizabeth Warren and Representative James McGovern. They're just two examples of people who want the budget for immigration and customs enforcement zeroed out. A recent poll by Morning Consult found the majority of voters polled think that the government should keep ICE, while 25% said they want the funding cut off. But what exactly does ICE do? And why do some want to see it gone? Answers from Professor Rebecca Hamlin of the University of Massachusetts Amherst.
Well, I think that ICE has been in the news a lot lately, and not in a good way, right? It's been getting so much press in terms of the harsh immigration enforcement strategies and tactics it's been using. And so I think people are really starting to pay attention to that. And in particular, this recent controversy about family separation has got people to sort of be more outraged about some of the strategies that the Trump administration is using to enforce immigration in this country.
When ICE was formed, Immigration Customs Enforcement, the formal name,
yes.
Back in 2003, it was a reorganization following the September 11th attacks.
Right.
And help people understand broadly what it's supposed to do, how ICE is supposed to function.
Well, I think it was supposed to function as a security agency, right? As a deportation force. That's what it was designed to do in 2003. So it was really created as a reaction to the September 11th attacks, as you mentioned. And it was a little bit of a new beast. Like the previous iteration of Immigration and Naturalization Service, or the INS, as we used to call it, was housed in the Department of Justice.
So to be clear, it's not as if this country went from nothing to something in 2003. No. It was a change in direction.
ICE did not invent harsh immigration enforcement by any means. The U.S. has been doing that since the 1880s, but the INS had been in existence for 70 years within the Department of Justice. And so the big reshuffling when the DHS was created as this behemoth agency that incorporated more than 20 other agencies, at that moment, ICE was created when the INS was sort of split in half, and the Immigration and Naturalization Services was one agency, Customs and Border Patrol was a different agency, and then this new baby that was sort of born from the Department of Homeland Security got formed, and that's ICE. So it had a security focus from the beginning.
And so one of the things that you look at as a professor is you're constantly sort of looking at the way that immigration is discussed in relation to politics. And so now we're hearing calls from mainly people in the Democratic Party. Yeah. We've heard Senator Elizabeth Warren, we've heard Representative McGovern, even Ariana Presley, who's running for a position out in the Boston area, called for this for the government to defund ICE. Right. I think people more often hear about a call to defund an agency connected to a budget woe. You know, we're over budget, so we're going to slash X, Y, and Z. Why do you think that this is being brought into the political realm right now?
I actually don't think it's a new tactic to call for the abolition of an agency, and defunding it or abolishing it are sort of two different strains of this critique we've been hearing. But Republicans in particular call for this type of thing quite regularly, right? So they sometimes call for the abolition or the defunding of the Internal Revenue Service.
The Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which we get money from at PBS.
Former Texas Governor Rick Perry called for the abolition of several different government agencies during presidential debates, and including, ironically, one that he is now running. But it's something that I think is a tool or a strategy that people use when they're really unhappy with the way an agency is doing its job.
Yeah, and one more note about that poll, we said it off the top that 25% of people are in favor of it, but obviously that means that somewhere in the realm of 75% support this agency. Right. In looking at the ICE website, it pointed out that they're funded by $6 billion, but interesting to me, it jumped out that they are ICE, which I thought of as something that's governing domestic enforcement of border patrol and other things. They're in 46 countries. Can you talk about the international piece of ICE?
So ICE is the enforcement body that does what Customs and Border Control don't do. So some people might be confused about whether ICE is border control. It's a different agency. Customs and Border Patrol is at the border, the physical border. And ICE enforces internally to the United States and then internationally is involved in enforcement. So sort of everything but the border in a way, bringing the border inside the territory of the US and looking beyond the physical border to try to enforce immigration law all over the world. Because ICE is embedded in this massive international structure of international criminal enforcement. So
so then how are the two agencies then working together? Because we do often confuse them, right?
Yes, we very often confuse them. So one of the things that ICE does is removal. So if somebody is taken into custody by the Border Control and then put into some sort of proceeding that leads to their removal, it's actually ICE that executes the deportation. So I think that's kind of how they work together in a lot of ways.
Looking at, ICE has a 5-year plan on its website, which is operating through 2020. It explains 3 key goals for the agency, and I'm going to read them verbatim. Counterterrorism and protect the borders. Protect the borders through efficient immigration enforcement, and operate an efficient, effective agency. What do you think of those as strategic goals for an agency such as this?
I mean, they're pretty vague, I would say. They don't get really specific about how the agency is going to prioritize. I think to me, the biggest challenge of an agency that's tasked with enforcing immigration law all over the entire United States and globally is how to prioritize, who to focus on, where to spend the money, how to decide what are the absolutely biggest threats. Because of course there are terrible people trying to do terrible things, and ICE wants to stop them from doing that, right? But how to figure out where those people are and how to spend the money most appropriately, I think is the biggest challenge of an agency that has $6 billion.
Well, because one of the things that, as you mentioned a minute ago, is history, right? And we look at the history of what's happened in this country to various groups of people, whether it's Catholics or Italians or Japanese following World War II. There seems to be a time in the country where there's a focus on a certain set of people or a certain type of person, and then we shift away. What does history tell us about this type of interaction that we have with people?
I think history tells us that we always are looking for a group to target when especially economic times are tough. There's a pattern of that happening in this country. When the gold rush ended, all of a sudden we passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, right? When there's economic downturn and tightening of the economy in the 1920s, again, we see national origins quotas being put into place. So I think that's a pretty common theme in U.S. history, that that people target immigrants when times are tough.
And what do you think that we should learn from what's happening with the current immigration debate relative to history right now?
Well, I think one of the things we should learn is that people come here to the United States primarily from countries that the United States has had some involvement in or interaction with over time, right? So we often engage in foreign policy that encourages people to come here and then sort of act surprised when they're here. And I think that's one of the things that is the most troubling to me as someone who studies immigration policy, especially in a historical way, is the lack of understanding about America's history in Central America that is causing so much of the upheaval and violence in Central America today.
And the U.S.'s role in that, whether
absolutely.
it's...
Yeah, absolutely. And then to sort of turn around and act like people coming from that region are sort of seeking benefits or only economically motivated, when really they're motivated by fear in a lot of cases, I think is something that troubles a lot of people, especially when the tactics that ICE is using seem to be very indiscriminate in terms of trying to understand why people are here.